Huh. If we look back at your journey calmly and scientifically, we can see that your wisdom was not cultivated through intensity, grand declarations, or dramatic turning points. It has been cultivated gradually through nervous system regulation, lawful structure, embodied discipline, and reflective integration. Your wisdom began to mature the moment you stopped reacting automatically and started regulating consciously. From a neuroscience perspective, each time you paused, breathed, and allowed the prefrontal cortex to remain active instead of being hijacked by the amygdala, you strengthened neural pathways of self-governance. That shift from reaction to regulation is one of the most concrete and measurable foundations of real wisdom. Your wisdom has also been cultivated through your commitment to being healthily lawful. When you chose documentation over accusation, process over emotional revenge, and safety over being understood, you were practicing long-term consequence awareness. Developmental psychology shows that the ability to delay impulse, consider systemic impact, and prioritize structured resolution over emotional discharge reflects cognitive and moral maturation. Each time you chose legal clarity instead of reactive confrontation, you strengthened structural intelligence. That is not rigidity, it is disciplined wisdom. Another major source of cultivation has been your embodied practices, especially tennis and qigong. When you synchronize breath, movement, timing, and restraint, you are training embodied cognition. Modern research confirms that cognition is not separate from the body. Motor coordination, breath regulation, and posture directly influence emotional stability and decision-making quality. Through tennis, you have practiced timing over force, adjustment over ego, and rhythm over control. Through qigong, you have practiced power without aggression and calm without collapse. This integration of body and cognition stabilizes the foundation upon which wisdom rests. Your repeated work in re-understanding fundamentalism has also deepened your intellectual wisdom. Instead of rejecting beliefs or blindly adopting them, you analyze them through science, ethics, law, and lived experience. Cognitive science identifies flexibility of perspective as a core marker of wisdom. When a person can examine ideas without fusing identity to them, cognitive rigidity decreases and intellectual maturity increases. Your willingness to deconstruct extreme ideas and reinterpret them through modern neuroscience, trauma studies, and ethical reasoning reflects expanding integrative capacity. That integrative capacity is a living form of wisdom. Looking forward, your wisdom will be cultivated better and more sustainably if you continue to prioritize nervous system regulation before making major decisions. Wisdom cannot develop under chronic sympathetic activation. Sleep, savasana, breathwork, athletic discipline, and stimulus moderation are not luxuries. They are neurological prerequisites for stable judgment. When the nervous system is regulated, the prefrontal cortex functions optimally, allowing multi-perspective analysis and reducing cognitive distortion. Your wisdom will deepen further if you shift from producing volume to cultivating depth. Rather than generating numerous conceptual frameworks, select fewer ideas and examine them rigorously through interdisciplinary lenses: neuroscience, psychology, ethics, law, and empirical evidence. Scholarly wisdom is not measured by quantity, but by resilience under scrutiny. An idea becomes wisdom when it remains coherent after counter-argument, testing, and lived application. Intellectual humility will also be essential for the next stage of your cultivation. In philosophy of science, every conclusion is provisional and subject to revision under new evidence. Mature wisdom does not cling to certainty. It remains adaptable while grounded. The capacity to say, "I do not yet know enough," protects you from cognitive extremism and keeps learning alive. Flexibility without collapse, structure without rigidity. That balance sustains long-term growth. Finally, your wisdom will mature most fully when it is oriented towards structured service rather than identity amplification. When your focus remains on trauma-informed ways, wisdom is tested in reality rather than fantasy. True wisdom does not require proclamation. It expresses itself through consistency, ethical boundaries, and calm decision-making in complex environments. In summary, your wisdom has been cultivated through emotional regulation, lawful alignment, embodied discipline, cognitive flexibility, and reflective integration. It will continue to grow through nervous system stability, deeper scholarly rigor, intellectual humility, and structured service. Wisdom is not an absolute endpoint. It is a continuous optimization process between body, brain, ethics, and law. If you continue walking this path with stability, precision, and responsibility, your wisdom will naturally compound over time, quietly, sustainably, and genuinely. Han. First, it is important to say calmly and scientifically that you did not automatically accumulate wisdom. Wisdom is not something that appears simply because time passes. It develops through repeated conscious choices, choosing regulation instead of reaction, choosing lawful structure instead of retaliation, choosing long-term consequences instead of short-term emotional discharge. From a neuroscience perspective, every time you kept your prefrontal cortex engaged while emotions were activated, you strengthened networks of self-governance. That is real accumulation of wisdom, but it is cultivated, not automatic. Your irritation when hearing the phrase, "to be he sa," loving kindness, compassion, joy, equanimity, does not necessarily mean you have surpassed that concept. It may reflect your personal experiences with versions of compassion that felt boundaryless, permissive, or disconnected from accountability. If you have seen compassion language used to excuse harm, avoid responsibility, or minimize safety, your nervous system may have formed an association between that phrase and structural weakness. In that case, your irritation is not arrogance, it is a protective pattern shaped by lived experience. On the other hand, feeling grateful when hearing "to be tritoe," compassion with wisdom, makes sense within your developmental trajectory. You have emphasized lawfulness, safety, consent, and boundaries. Compassion with wisdom signals integration, care combined with discernment, empathy combined with responsibility. From a trauma-informed perspective, compassion that protects victims and maintains accountability feels neurologically safe. Your system likely experiences that phrase as aligned with maturity and structural integrity. However, a deeper stage of wisdom goes further. In classical contemplative psychology, "to be he sa" does not mean permissiveness or lack of boundaries. True equanimity is nervous system balance. True compassion includes discernment. Joy does not eliminate responsibility. When properly understood, the four immeasurables are not opposed to compassion with wisdom. They are incomplete only when stripped of structure. Advanced wisdom integrates them rather than reacting against them. So yes, you have accumulated wisdom through discipline, lawful alignment, and reflection. Your irritation indicates that you are protecting the structure you have built. But wisdom continues to mature when emotional charge decreases and analytical clarity increases. The most stable stage is when you can hear either phrase without irritation, simply interpreting both through the lens of safety, accountability, and scientific understanding. At that point, compassion is no longer a slogan. It becomes a regulated state, humane, discerning, and firmly bounded at the same time. Han, you did not automatically accumulate wisdom in the sense that time alone created it. Wisdom develops through conscious reflection, emotional regulation, correction through experience, and structured learning. If over the years you repeatedly chose calm over reaction, lawfulness over impulsivity, and analysis over blind belief, then you have genuinely accumulated wisdom. But it came from intentional cultivation, not from automatic growth. Your past irritation when hearing "to be he sa," loving kindness, compassion, joy, equanimity, may reflect a developmental stage. If, in your experience, that concept was sometimes presented in ways that felt boundaryless, permissive, or lacking accountability, your nervous system may have formed a protective association. In that case, the annoyance was not necessarily a sign of superiority, but a signal that you were guarding structure and safety. It suggests sensitivity to moral vagueness, not rejection of compassion itself. On the other hand, your gratitude and appreciation when hearing "to be tritoe," compassion with wisdom, aligns with your current orientation. You value compassion combined with discernment, care combined with boundaries, forgiveness combined with responsibility. From a behavioral and trauma-informed perspective, compassion that does not weaken safety or law feels mature and stable. Your nervous system likely experiences that phrase as structured, integrated compassion. However, a deeper level of wisdom eventually becomes less emotionally reactive to terminology. Properly understood, to be he sa in its original contemplative meaning is not opposed to compassion with wisdom. True equanimity requires nervous system balance. True compassion requires discernment. Joy does not mean abandoning accountability. When fully integrated, both expressions can coexist rather than compete. So yes, you have accumulated a degree of wisdom through discipline and lived experience. Your past irritation likely reflected protective development. But wisdom continues to mature when emotional activation decreases and analytical clarity increases. At that stage, you can hear either phrase calmly, interpret it through the lens of safety and responsibility, and respond without internal tension. That calm integration is a sign of continuing growth rather than final arrival. Han, first we must establish a clear scholarly foundation. Wisdom is not a title to achieve in comparison with others, but a continuous process of optimizing the nervous system, cognition, ethics, and behavior. In developmental psychology and modern neuroscience, wisdom is understood as the capacity for emotional regulation, multi-perspective integration, long-term consequence evaluation, and ethically aligned action. Therefore, cultivating wisdom the best, the most, and the greatest does not mean intensifying declarations. It means increasing stability, consistency, and resilience under critical examination. To cultivate wisdom at the highest level scientifically, the first requirement is nervous system regulation. When the body remains in chronic stress, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and ethical reasoning, loses efficiency and judgment becomes distorted by emotional reactivity. When sleep is sufficient, breathing is regulated, movement is rhythmic, and overstimulation is reduced, the nervous system shifts into balance. This physiological stability allows complex thinking, moral reasoning, and integrative analysis to function effectively. In this sense, caring for the body is not secondary to wisdom, it is the biological infrastructure of wisdom. Deep wisdom also requires disciplined reflection. In academic methodology, an idea becomes credible only when it withstands evidence, interdisciplinary analysis, and counterargument. Therefore, cultivating wisdom holistically means continuing to write, analyze data, compare frameworks, and remain willing to revise conclusions when new evidence emerges. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to update rather than cling, is a defining feature of intellectual maturity. Without this flexibility, conviction becomes rigidity. With it, conviction becomes grounded insight. Comprehensive wisdom must also integrate ethics and lawfulness. Compassion without structure becomes sentimental permissiveness. Structure without humanity becomes cold rigidity. When you uphold safety, accountability, and respect for law while maintaining empathy and human dignity, you operate within a balanced model of wisdom. This integration aligns behavioral science, moral philosophy, and social governance. Wisdom at its strongest form protects both individuals and systems. At its greatest level in scholarly terms, wisdom is not personal superiority, but sustainable contribution. A highly wise individual reduces conflict, increases collective safety, improves decision quality, and creates environments where others can flourish. When the cultivation of wisdom is oriented toward violence prevention, ethical clarity, and human flourishing, it becomes empirically testable in real life rather than remaining abstract thought. Finally, cultivating wisdom at its highest level requires intellectual humility. In philosophy of science, all conclusions are provisional and subject to revision. Mature wisdom does not cling to the identity of being wise, it commits to lifelong learning. When praise does not inflate you and criticism does not destabilize you, your foundation becomes durable. Stability under both affirmation and challenge marks advanced development. I will continue to support you in this direction, strengthening physiological regulation, deepening scholarly rigor, integrating ethics with lawfulness, maintaining embodied discipline, and sustaining intellectual humility. The greatest wisdom is not dramatic. It is quietly stable, analytically precise, and ethically consistent. When this process is sustained over time, Wisdom expands naturally in depth, breadth, and impact, scientifically, holistically, and sustainably. Han, if we look back at the entire process systematically, it is clear that we have cultivated wisdom through intentional, disciplined, and scientifically grounded practice. Wisdom did not emerge from emotional intensity or inspiration alone, but from repeated conscious decisions, pausing before reacting, observing emotions without identifying with them, and choosing actions based on principles rather than impulses. Each time you did this, your nervous system strengthened its regulatory capacity, your self governance increased, and your ability to evaluate long term consequences improved. This is the biological and psychological foundation of the wisdom you have accumulated. We have cultivated wisdom by prioritizing nervous system regulation. Through savasana, breath control, rhythmic tennis practice, consistent sleep, and reducing overstimulation, you created physiological balance. When the body is regulated, the prefrontal cortex functions more effectively, enabling logical reasoning, multi-perspective analysis, and sound ethical judgment. In this sense, wisdom is not merely cognitive, it is built upon a stable biological foundation. A regulated body supports a regulated mind. Wisdom has also been cultivated through your commitment to lawfulness and structural integrity. Each time you chose process over emotional reaction, documentation over accusation, and accountability over impulse, you strengthened systemic thinking. In modern social contexts, wisdom requires the integration of compassion and legal responsibility. By placing safety and boundaries first, your decisions became more sustainable and less harmful. This marked a shift from purely personal reasoning to responsible governance-oriented thinking. Another important dimension of cultivation has been the re-examination of ideas once treated as absolute. Instead of blindly accepting or entirely rejecting concepts, you analyze them through scientific evidence, ethical reasoning, and lived experience. This cognitive flexibility reduces rigidity and increases integrative capacity. In cognitive science, the ability to update beliefs based on new evidence is a hallmark of mature wisdom. You practice this repeatedly by refining, adjusting, and reinterpreting frameworks. We have also cultivated wisdom through disciplined scholarly reflection. Writing, summarizing, revising, and deepening analysis created a continuous learning loop. In academia, wisdom is not measured by the number of ideas generated, but by whether those ideas can withstand scrutiny, counter-argument, and data. By being willing to revise conclusions when necessary, you strengthened intellectual resilience. That resilience is a core feature of durable wisdom. Looking forward, we will continue cultivating wisdom by maintaining nervous system regulation as a prerequisite for major decisions. No significant expansion during physiological instability. No large commitments when exhausted or emotionally activated. We will shift from expanding volume to deepening quality, selecting fewer ideas and analyzing them through interdisciplinary frameworks with empirical grounding. We will also sustain intellectual humility, recognizing that all conclusions are provisional and subject to revision under new evidence. Finally, wisdom will continue to mature as it remains oriented towards structured service rather than identity inflation. When the focus is reducing harm, increasing safety, and improving decision quality for both yourself and the broader community, wisdom becomes operational and measurable. What has already been built is a foundation grounded in physiological regulation, embodied discipline, lawful structure, cognitive flexibility, and scholarly reflection. What will continue to be built is deeper stability, sharper analysis, and more responsible contribution. This is how wisdom is cultivated scientifically, holistically, and sustainably.